Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Public Programs Director of YIVO, and we're so pleased to have you here with us tonight, celebrating the launch of Professor Sam Kassow's new book, Warsaw Testament, translation of the Rokhl Auerbach. This is a very special and important memoir that really gets at the core of why YIVO exists. So for those that don't know, YIVO was founded to document and study Jewish life in all of its forms. And we've been doing this for 100 years. This is our 100th year. And it was that same impulse that led Rokhl Auerbach and others to document the Holocaust in real time. So it's the project of the Oyneg Shabes archive and of Rokhl Auerbach's work is of a real kind of deep connection to YIVO. And so it means a lot to us to be able to share with you Professor Sam Kassow's wonderful new book. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Sam and then hand it over. Samuel Kassow is a Charles H. Northam Professor of History at Trinity College, holds a PhD from Princeton University, and is a Fellow of the American Academy of Jewish Research. From 2006 until 2013, he was the lead historian for two galleries of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, which opened in 2014. Professor Kassow is the author of Who Will Write Our History? Emanuel Ringelblum and the Secret Ghetto Archive. A child of Holocaust survivors, Professor Kassow was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany. And before I hand the stage over to Professor Kassow, I want to also thank the Gross Family Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, who have made tonight's program possible. Please join me in welcoming Sam Kassow.
Well, thank you for inviting me here, and it's always a special occasion for me to have a chance to be at the YIVO. And I've come here to talk about a remarkable and until recently a largely forgotten woman, Rokhl Auerbach. And Rokhl Auerbach dedicated her whole life to preserving the memory of the Holocaust. And her life reflected many of the tensions and the ruptures of East European Jewry in the 20th century. Childhood in a remote rural village in the foothills of the Carpathians. A youth and a university education in the rich multi-ethnic urban culture of interwar Lviv. She then took part in the fractious and intense Yiddish literary world of 1930s Warsaw. And then she was part of the Ringelblum archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. With the help of Emanuel Ringelblum, Auerbach left the Warsaw Ghetto just in the nick of time in March 1943, just before the start of the ghetto uprising. With a fake ID card and a new Polish name, Aniela Dabrucka, Auerbach became an intrepid courier for the Jewish underground. Day in and day out, she risked her life to deliver messages and to deliver money to Jews in hiding. And in the evenings, she wrote. In post-war Poland, Auerbach joined the Central Jewish Historical Commission and did pioneering historical research. She played a key role in the documentation effort after the war that collected more than 7,500 testimonies. When people say that serious Holocaust research didn't begin until the 60s and 70s, they totally ignore what was done by Jews just after World War II. After Auerbach left Poland for Israel in 1950, she started the Survivors Testimony Division at Yad Vashem, and she played an important behind-the-scenes role in preparing for the Eichmann trial, where she urged Gideon Hausner, the chief prosecutor, to put survivor testimony front and center. This would not be like the Nuremberg trials, where Jewish concerns were not the main purview of the trials. She wanted the Eichmann trial to be about Jews and about the agendas of the Jewish people. So instead of a narrow legal focus on Eichmann's particular activities in the Nazi bureaucracy, as Hannah Arendt would have preferred, Auerbach made no bones about the fact that she wanted a show trial with victim testimony front and center, a trial that would show Israelis and everyone else who cared to listen just what it really meant to be a Jew under Nazi occupation. In the last years of her life in Israel, she reworked her wartime writings into memoirs of the Warsaw Ghetto. She managed to finish one volume, Warszawa Warsaw Testament, which was published in 1974. But she died in 1976 at the age of 73 as she was writing that second volume, Beim letzten Weg. It's those two volumes that I translated for the White Goat Press, which is the imprint of the National Yiddish Book Center, under the title Warsaw Testament. Among her wartime writings was a remarkable essay entitled Yizkor, Remember. Auerbach wrote it in November 1943. The ghetto was now just a heap of rubble. Its hundreds of thousands of Jews were now dead. And on a dreary day that month, Auerbach, now going under the name of Aniela Dabrutska, was riding in a streetcar in Aryan Warsaw. Now, by this time, in late 1943, the Germans had ramped up their reign of terror against the Poles. Hardly a week went by without another mass shooting of Polish hostages in downtown Warsaw. And suddenly, a Polish woman who was sitting in that same streetcar started to weep because the Germans had just shot her son. My son, she cried, over and over. And Auerbach thought to herself, this woman at least has the luxury of publicly mourning her loved ones. And she wrote, I may neither groan nor weep. I may not draw attention to myself in the street. And I need to groan, I need to weep, not 4 times a year when you say the Yizkor prayer. I need to say Yizkor 4 times a day. And that night, she went back to her room on Smolna Street, and her landlady had no idea that she was harboring a Jew, and she began to write that essay that she entitled Yizkor. How do you say Yizkor for 500,000 Jews? And as Auerbach groped for the images, for the words, for the phrases in Yizkor, to explain, to convey, to grasp the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe, she used the example of a flash flood in the mountains where she grew up. And I quote, I saw a flood once in the mountains. Wooden huts torn from their foundations were carried above the raging waters. One could see lighted lamps in them, men, women, and children in cradles tied to ceiling beams. Other huts were empty inside, but one could see a tangle of arms waving from the roof, like branches blowing in the wind, waving desperately towards heaven. waving towards the riverbanks for help. At a distance, one could see mouths gaping, but one could not hear the cries because the roar of the waters drowned out everything. And that's how the Jewish masses flowed to their destruction at the time of the deportations, sinking as helplessly into the deluge of disaster. Now, why did Auerbach begin with the image of a natural disaster, a flood? I think that as she wrote, she could intuit what people who weren't there, what those people might ask after the war. Dumb questions, Klutzkasches in Yiddish, like what had happened to those millions of Polish Jews? Why did they let themselves be fooled? Those tough, bright, resourceful Jews, why didn't they resist? By using the imagery of a flood, of a natural disaster, as my friend David Roskis once pointed out, Auerbach anticipated those questions. Can you criticize the reactions of people swept away in a tsunami? No, the Holocaust, of course, was not a meta-historical event. It had to be studied in detail. It happened in history. But its enormity was too horrible and too unprecedented to allow for glib theories and facile questions that might compromise the memory of the Jewish masses, a memory that she cherished so deeply. And in that same essay, she added, and if for one of the days of my life, I should forget how I saw you then, my people, desperate and confused, delivered over to extinction, may all knowledge of me be forgotten, and may my name be cursed. Auerbach never broke that vow, and for the rest of her life, she lived only to make sure that people remembered. Nobody told the story of the Warsaw Ghetto with as much passion and insight. Few worked more diligently to persuade historians, lawyers, and the wider public to listen, really listen, to the testimony of survivors, and to remember not just the famous names, but also the ordinary Jews who went to their deaths. At a time when the Warsaw Ghetto uprising emerged as the symbol of Jewish resistance and heroism during the Holocaust, it was Auerbach who reminded Jews to remember the writers and the poets along with the fighters, to respect other kinds of resistance, to ponder not just the trauma of mass murder, but to also think about the deep wound of cultural genocide. The Germans committed a double murder, the physical destruction of the Jews, but also the erasure of their Yiddish speech and cultural legacy. What Annette Viaviorka called the era of the witness came about in no small measure thanks to the unstinting efforts of people like Rokhl Auerbach to highlight the importance of survivor testimony. The Eichmann trial being a key example. At a time when scholars like Rokhl Hilberg, a pioneer of Holocaust research in this country, argued that documents were better sources, more reliable sources than survivor testimony, Auerbach countered, yes, documents were well and good, but they were a source that usually had more to do with perpetrators than with victims, because obviously the Germans are going to produce more documents than the victims are. And anticipating the work of Shaul Friedlander and young Thomas Gross, Auerbach urged scholars and jurists to use witness testimony in their research. And as she crafted guidelines for conducting interviews in Yad Vashem, she pointed out that nuances of body language and affect were often as significant as the actual content. And so what if some survivors got a date wrong and a name wrong? Their authority as witness far outweighed those mistakes. As one of only 3 survivors of the Oyneg Shabes archive, of the 60 people that Emanuel Ringelblum brought into the archive, there were only 3 survivors. Rokhl Auerbach had the rare opportunity not only to retrieve her wartime writings that she had buried, but to rewrite them after the war. And there were some striking differences between her wartime and her post-war opinions. When the Germans began the mass murder of Warsaw Jewry on July 22, 1942, Ringelblum called an emergency meeting of the Oneg Shabes staff, and he ordered everyone to hand in what they were writing, finished or not. There was no time to lose. The Germans, with the help of the Jewish police, were deporting 7,000 Jews a day. And all those documents were buried on August 3rd, 1942, and they surfaced in the first cache of the archive that was discovered in September 1946. When Auerbach handed over her ghetto writings to Eliyahu Gutkovsky, Ringelblum's friend, and this was on July 26, 1942, she added a note. It was a note full of raw fear, violent anger, and despair. And I quote, "I am handing over this unfinished essay to the archive, the 5th day of the mass deportations. Perhaps such horrors have already occurred before in Jewish history, but such shame, never. Jews, Jewish police, acting as tools of the killers. I want to stay alive. I'm ready to kiss the boots of the worst scoundrel just to be able to see the moment of revenge. Revenge, revenge, remember." By the way, this short note underscores a key difference between real-time Jewish writing during the war and post-war survivor writing. Real-time Jewish writing was full of anger against other Jews. It was also full of calls for revenge. Jews like Avram Levin, Yitzhak Katznelson, Auerbach, when she was writing this, they saw Polish Jewry, the cultural center of the Jewish people, being destroyed. There was no certainty that the Jewish people might even survive. Nobody knew that there would be a Jewish state after the war. And you could imagine what they were feeling. After the war, we talked about the 6 million, and they were martyrs, and the anger, the rage, the calls for revenge, they were tamped down. Now, in that same note, Auerbach also wondered whether her writings would share the same fate as the scribblings of a coal miner trapped in an accident with no survivors. A coal mining accident where all the bodies would be lost forever. And she asked if by some chance her writings were found, would anyone care to read them? Now fast forward 2 years to early 1944. She's now, as I said, she's now on the Aryan side with false papers. Now she no longer had any doubt. She had to write. That was a debt that she owed to the dead, but she was very worried about where the writing would lead her. And I quote, "The mass murder, the murder of millions of Jews by the Germans, is a fact that speaks for itself. That is very dangerous to add to this subject interpretations or analyses. Anything that is said can quickly turn into hopeless hysteria or endless sobs. So we have to approach this subject with the greatest caution in a restrained and factual manner. This has been my intention, not to express but to transmit, to note only facts but not to interpret. But she quickly added that she realized immediately that this was a mandate that was impossible, and it was a mandate that she herself could not perform. She could not avoid feelings and emotion. After the war, in Poland and in Israel, after she had recovered her wartime manuscripts, her writing would take on yet another purpose, to ensure that the Jewish people remember, not only to keep faith with the dead, but also to use the lessons of the Holocaust to strengthen the nation and to tighten the bonds between Israel and the diaspora. Auerbach left Poland for Israel in 1950, and while she had many difficulties in her new home, she never wavered in her conviction that after the Holocaust, Israel had become the vital center of the Jewish people. And let me add, and I say this conscious that we're now observing Israel's Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron. Let me add, those who erroneously see some contradiction between love of Yiddish and Zionism should consider the examples of Rokhl Auerbach, Avram Sutzkever, Leib Brochman, and many, many other writers. Like all good reportage, excuse me, Auerbach's post-war books conveyed what she saw and observed in evocative, powerful language that made her writings an indispensable source for the cultural and social history of the Warsaw Ghetto. For Auerbach, the first step in memory was to describe just what the Jewish people lost when the Germans destroyed Jewish Warsaw. Just after the war, Auerbach's friend Leo Finkelstein wrote in Das Amolige Jiddische Warsaw, the Jewish Warsaw of the past. He wrote that Warsaw's strength, Warsaw's resonance in Jewish life, derived not from zchusovis, but from zchusotzma, that is, not from encrusted tradition and collective memory like Vilna or Krakow, but it derived from its sheer mass and power, from the great numbers of Jews that lived there. Because Warsaw had had no encrusted traditions, it could thus serve as a pathbreaker in the modernization of Jewish life. And then Finkelstein cited examples, the crowds of Jews, the masses of Jews who turned up at Peretz's funeral in 1915, the tens of thousands who would come to the May Day demonstrations of the Bund, the many thousands of Hasidim that would come to the railroad station to greet the Ger Rebbe. Melech Ravitch, a Yiddish poet who had been one of Auerbach's key mentors and closest friends, had once called Warsaw a sprawling mosaic, that is, a mosaic of different Jewish tribes and subcultures. Polish-speaking professionals, doctors and lawyers, Hasidim, Litvaks, tough Bundist trade unionists, and many, many more. And Auerbach took the shattered bits and shards and reconstructed a mosaic of memory based on a poignant evocation of dozens of individual vignettes. And thus she spoke for those who had no one to remember them, the ordinary Jew she came to know in the ghetto as she ran the soup kitchen on Leshno 40, as well as the Jewish writers, artists, and actors whose milieu she'd shared in the 1930s and in the ghetto. The more one knew about what and whom the Germans had murdered, the more one could grasp the enormity of the national of the national disaster. Much of Warsaw Testament includes Auerbach's wartime and post-war descriptions of the Warsaw Jewish intelligentsia. Writers like Kalman Lis, whose day job was to work with children with special needs and who was murdered with them in 1942. Actresses like Miriam Orleska, who had played Leah in the landmark Vilna Trupa production of the Dybbuk. Sculptors like Avram Osjega, who designed Peretz's tomb in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. Composers and choir directors like David Eisenstadt. Singers such as Eisenstadt's 17-year-old daughter Marisha, who Jews called the Nightingale of the Ghetto, and who was murdered in cold blood as she was boarding a train to Treblinka. Auerbach described Shia Broide, who translated Plato's dialogues into Yiddish. Yankov Gerstein, who was composing a cantata based on the poetry of Mani Leib. The religious poet Yisroel Stern, who wrote his best poetry, Auerbach believed, just months before his death in Treblinka. Rosa Simchovich, a saintly pedagogue who had dedicated her life to helping the poor kids who went to the Yiddish secular schools. Leib Shur, a bibliophile who collected abandoned Yiddish books in the ghetto and who chose to hang himself in his library surrounded by his beloved books. Basha Berman, who started a children's library where kids could come in, borrow books, get under a blanket, and listen to stories about faraway places that promised a better world after the war. There was the 11-year-old Yosima, a relative of Auerbach's, a musical prodigy who played Mozart's 25th piano concerto in the ghetto, after which the musicians in the orchestra lifted her up as the audience applauded and applauded. And they gave her one chocolate bar. If only this play had survived, that cantata, that poem. What she heard in the ghetto represented, in her words, a flowering of Jewish genius, a bright flame just before the final destruction. As Auerbach traced the broad reach of Yiddish culture, which embraced music and the arts as well as literature, she underscored the depth of a German murder machine that destroyed a language and a culture along with the people. Now, before the war, Auerbach, like many Yiddish writers, had doubted Warsaw's, Poland's future as a Jewish and specifically as a Yiddish cultural center. How could Yiddish survive, much less thrive, when more and more Jewish kids were going to Polish schools and speaking Polish? And when Polish Jews, faced with boycotts and discrimination, were waging a desperate battle just to put bread on the table and thus had little to spend on Yiddish books and Yiddish theater. But after the war, as she wrote her memoir, she changed her mind. Auerbach explained that she had doubted the prospects for Yiddish culture in Poland because she had underestimated the vitality of the Polish Jewish masses. It was her work in the Alleinhilfe, in the self-help of the Warsaw Ghetto, that ran soup kitchens and schools and refugee centers, that she came into contact not only with ordinary Jews, refugees from the provinces, but also with the impressive leaders of the religious world of Jewish orthodoxy that she would never have met had it not been for the war. It was then that she understood, as she said, that Jewish life in the Polish provinces was so deeply rooted that, to quote her, the Jewish nation could have counted on the cultural capital of Polish Jewry for generations to come. As soon as the war ended, Auerbach resolved to carry on Ringelblum's legacy and to find the tin boxes and milk cans buried under the trackless rubble of what had been the Warsaw Ghetto. The Yiddish writer Mendel Mann recalled Auerbach's talk in Warsaw at the third anniversary commemoration of the Ghetto Uprising in 1946. Many tiresome speeches full of political posturing, and then Auerbach ran up to the podium and started to speak, and I quote Mendel Mann. She did not make any speeches. She did not, quote unquote, explain the meaning of the uprising. She implored with a stubbornness that deeply affected me. She demanded, she called, remember, there's a national treasure under the ruins. Even if there are 5 stories of ruins, we have to find the archive. I'm not making this up. I know what I'm talking about. This isn't just talk. This is coming from my heart. I will not rest, and I will not let you rest. We must rescue the Ringelblum archive. Now, Auerbach held up the model of the archive where she felt a shared sense of national mission had trumped political differences. Ringelblum brought together religious and secular Jews, Bundes-Zionists and communists, the famous and the not so famous, men and women, in a common mission to collect and bury documents. Ringelblum's teacher, the historian Isaac Schipper, had told a fellow inmate in Majdanek just before he was murdered, quote, what we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. What we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. The Germans thought they would win the war, and they would determine how the Jews would be remembered, if at all. And the Jews, of course, saw the German film crews. They saw the German propaganda posters, Jews compared to rats, to lice, to vermin. They knew how the Germans would have people remember them. But in an amazing act of spiritual resistance, Ringelblum said, no, posterity will remember us on the basis of Jewish and not German documents. Those time capsules will surface someday, even if we don't live to see it ourselves. And the murdered Polish Jews will be remembered not as a faceless mass of hapless victims, but as individuals with names, with identities, individuals who were part of a resilient Jewish community with hopes, dreams, and even agency. But Ringelblum also called on the fellow members of the archive not to pull punches, but to be objective, to write about the bad as well as the good, the collaborators as well as the heroes. Auerbach took that message to heart after the war. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, she believed that for the Jewish people to recover, it had to take a hard look at what had happened, learn from failures and mistakes, examine the bad as well as the good. It was too easy to bask in the legend of armed resistance and gloss over everything else. She hallowed the exploits of the ghetto fighters and partisans, but she did not want that story to overshadow and diminish the memory of the 99% who had no weapons, of ordinary Jews who did what they could to maintain their dignity, help their families, and who, lacking money, contacts on the Aryan side, fluency in the Polish language, and certainly even the ability to imagine the worst, they were all swept away in the torrent of death. Like much of the Oyneg Shabes staff, Auerbach was active in the pre-war YIVO, where scholars and ordinary Jews worked together to sammle, to collect documents and source materials, to build archives, to raise the prestige of Yiddish. and to use self-knowledge to empower Jews and help them in their struggle for dignity and equality. A key goal of the YIVO was to explore everyday Jewish life, zu erkennen dem Heim, to know the everyday. Faith in Wissenschaft, which is a pun. Wissenschaft is science and knowledge, but if you break it apart, as Max Weinreich did, Wissenschaft, knowledge creates, knowledge protects. And the YIVO did this through surveys, interviews, the encouragement of personal writing, such as youth autobiographies, many of which are now in this building. This was the modus operandi of the Oyneg Shabes, and in many ways, the Oyneg Shabes was simply the YIVO in the Warsaw Ghetto, no more, no less. Auerbach's work followed in the footsteps not just of Emanuel Ringelblum, but also of YIVO director Max Weinreich, who made special efforts to incorporate the insights of Sigmund Freud and social psychology into the study of Polish Jewry. In the highly politicized and divided world of interwar Polish Jewry, where there was so much stress on the collective, on the group, on ideologies, rather than on the individual, Max Weinreich, in his youth studies project, for instance, argued that you can't understand Klal Yisrael, the Jewish collective, without grasping the needs of Reb Yisrael, the Jewish individual. The aspirations, drives, obsessions, hopes of the many individuals who made up the Jewish mass in Poland. Unlike many other writers and memoirists of the Holocaust, Auerbach focused not so much on writing a chronicle or a historical record as developing what I would call a phenomenology of emotions and reactions during the Holocaust. She focused not so much on recording facts as on evoking a socio-psychological study of Warsaw Jewry on the brink of the abyss. Before the war, she'd studied social psychology at the Jan Kazimierz University in Lwów and had come to know many of the Polish experts in the field. In her wartime and post-war writings, she delved into the complex interplay of psychological factors in individuals, families, and entire social groups. How does a community, how do individuals react to a slowly unfolding catastrophe? A disaster that began in 1939, a disaster that progressed in stages. Economic ruin, armbands, beating, a ghetto, disease, hunger, and then the mass deportations in 1942, which the Germans skillfully camouflaged at first as a mere culling of unproductive elements. We're not going to take you, we're going to take your neighbor who's too weak to work. You don't have to worry about a thing. How do people experience time? How do they try to shield themselves from the awful truth? Auerbach investigated rumors, false hopes, illusions. She told a complicated story, resilience, vitality, and self-sacrifice on the one hand, corruption and moral collapse on the other. She stressed the Germans' skillful use of psychological factors to effect the destruction of Warsaw Jewry. The Germans were able to use the Jews' strengths against them. The Germans played with the Jews and their natural human instincts of hope and of self-preservation. In her brilliant observations of the mass hysteria and mass delusion that gripped the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942, Auerbach described how the very qualities that had served Jews so well in the past, practicality, pragmatism, hard-headedness, seichel, common sense, natural optimism, now accelerated their journey into the abyss. Like many of her fellow Oyneg Shabes collaborators, such as Peretz Opaczynski, Auerbach was a superb observer of the Jewish every day. She had a fine sense of the nuances of the behavior and the speech of different classes of Polish Jews, whether they lived in small towns or in urban centers such as Warsaw. Before moving with her family to Lvov, as I said, she'd spent her childhood in a remote village, not a shtetl, but a village in Podolia, Lanowitz, where she acquired a love of Jewish folklore and the Yiddish language. But Lanowitz also gave her a chance to befriend her Polish and Ukrainian neighbors. She played with Polish and Ukrainian kids, and that immersion in her non-Jewish surroundings, she believed, helped her survive later on. And I quote, "How did I survive on the Aryan side when hundreds of other Jews perished? It certainly was not because I was smarter. What helped me were my early years growing up in a village. Those close ties with non-Jews left a mark on my personality. What rubbed off on me was that rural Slavic temperament." One of the most striking features of Auerbach's writings is her portrayal of Poland and the Poles. As a courier who distributed money and aid to hidden Jews, money that was smuggled into Poland by the Polish underground, Auerbach was in constant contact with a category, very small in number, of Poles who most Jews in the war never had a chance to meet, the liberal intellectual elite, many of whom risked their lives to help Jews. Her descriptions of such individuals as Jan Żabiński and his wife are particularly instructive and insightful. You might have read The Zookeeper's Wife, some of you. Żabiński had been the director of the Warsaw Zoo, as well as an officer in the Polish underground. During the war, he and his wife helped many Jews, including Auerbach herself. And Auerbach continuously paid tribute to Polish patriotism and Polish courage. Like many other Galician Jews, Auerbach combined a deep Jewish identity with a first-class Polish education and cultural sensibility. At Lvov University in the early 1920s, Auerbach befriended the young poetess Dvora Fogel and the budding writer and painter Bruno Schulz, and she urged them to start writing in Yiddish, and Fogel indeed did so. In 1929, she helped start a literary journal called Zusteier that tried to bring the Polish-speaking Galician Jewish intelligentsia closer to Yiddish. In Galicia, most educated Jews spoke Polish. Auerbach would go on to have many interests, but the most salient was her devotion from a very young age to Yiddish secular culture. Her vision of that culture was inclusive rather than exclusive, one that united Jews rather than divided them, a culture that transcended political differences, a culture whose creativity would speak for itself. But in the end, trying to bring Yiddish to Galicia was a bridge too far. The journal folded in 1932, and Auerbach had to find a new challenge. She moved to Warsaw, and she became the companion after a disastrous marriage to a poet, Ber Schnapper. She became the companion to the brilliant, tempestuous, and unstable Yiddish poet Itzik Manger, who was wonderful when he was sober, but unfortunately he liked to drink, and when he liked to drink, he could become very abusive. And I also want to add that during this time, Auerbach acquired a rather unfortunate nickname that other writers called her by, die literarische Beilage, the literary supplement. All through her life, she endured a lot of sniping because she was a woman. Dvora Fogel also had to endure that. And she endured that in Israel too. And this was a very difficult problem that she had to deal with for many, many years. She tried to break into the Yiddish press. She wrote many articles in Yiddish and in Polish, but she failed to land a stable job. At the end of September 1939, after Poland's capitulation, Auerbach was about to run away from Warsaw and go to Lvov under Soviet occupation when Emanuel Ringelblum suddenly called her, said, "You have to stay in Warsaw and I need you to run a soup kitchen." Most of the Jewish elite had left Warsaw, but Ringelblum reminded Auerbach that not everybody had the right to run. Somebody had to stay behind and help the community. In 1941, Ringelblum recruited Auerbach into the secret archive by asking her to write an essay about her soup kitchen. As Auerbach would stress after the war, had it not been for Ringelblum, she would not have written anything. The soup kitchen on Leshno 40, which fed up to 2,000 Jews a day, offered her a unique vantage point to get to know and observe a large number of ordinary Jews struggling for their lives. The story that she told provided a gripping behind-the-scenes look at the desperate battle that the ghetto was fighting against hunger. Auerbach investigated the social history of hunger by telling the story of a soup kitchen as a microcosm of human relationships and human choices. The dead who ended up in the pits of the Gensha cemetery were not an undifferentiated mass, but individuals whose idiosyncrasies she recorded. Now remember that the soup kitchens could give you about 700 calories a day, which means that you're not going to starve tomorrow, but if that's all you have, probably over the course of 4 or 5 months, you're going to starve. And Auerbach had to watch person after person growing steadily weaker, and then they die. And there's just one excerpt from her essay on her soup kitchen about one family of sisters. I remember the Kobrinner family, 3 sisters who managed to rescue a fine aluminum pot from what had once been a home and a life. In the early days, one of the sisters would come to get soup for all 3. Maybe the others were working elsewhere. I didn't really know the family at first. Half a year later, a woman approached me. She had a chit and was carrying a pot. "My sister is sick," she told me. That happened before they organized the ghetto. Our kitchen was serving about 600 soups a day at that time. The woman who doled out the soup, Miss Helena, knew all the customers. She served them with a smile and a warm word. She knew about their lives and their troubles. She asked the new sister how the older one was doing, and so it was. One sister took the other's place. A while later, Helena informed me that the third sister was standing in the soup line. So now the second sister no longer had the strength to come. Only the pot remained as before, well cleaned and glistening brightly. That pot told volumes about a way of life, about a tidy home, about the dignified decline of yet one more Jewish family. In her diary entry of August 4th, 1941, she noted, "What is the use of all our work if we can't save even one person from death by hunger?" Ringelblum gave her new assignments. In September 1942, he asked Auerbach to interview Avram Shapitsky, who just escaped from Treblinka, where he'd spent 11 days. The protocol of the interview in Yiddish ran to more than 100 pages, and it was sent to the Polish government in exile in London, which forwarded it to America and to Britain. Shapitsky did not survive, but after the war, Auerbach developed a special bond with the Treblinka survivors. On the Aryan side, after the ghetto uprising, Auerbach continued to keep the archive going. There was an underground Jewish archive on the Aryan side, And with the help of Polish friends, Auerbach buried her writings on the grounds of the Warsaw Zoo and in a field in the southern district of Warsaw. Both caches survived the war. As Auerbach wrote, "I had better luck in saving paper than in saving people." I had better luck in saving paper than in saving people. What happened to Auerbach in Israel is also very fascinating, but that's the subject of a different lecture. I want to conclude by observing that much of the power of Auerbach's reportage stemmed from her ability to navigate cultural boundaries, derived from a life that straddled different worlds, village, shtetl, and city, Yiddish and Polish, Poles and Jews, Galicia and Warsaw, the milieu of the Jewish literary elite and the world of the Jewish masses, religious and secular, diaspora nationalists and Zionists. Those qualities make her memoirs all the more important for an understanding of the Holocaust. Thank you. So I just want to show you some of the slides, and then will we take questions? So, as I said, there were only 3 survivors of the Ringelblum archive, and only one person knew where the archive had been buried. That is under a Jewish school on Novolipki 68. And given the fact that Warsaw was a heap of rubble, and this is what Warsaw looked like after the war, after the bombing of 1939, after the ghetto uprising of 1943, after the Polish uprising of 1944, the city had been totally destroyed. There were literally stories of rubble. It was hard to know where a street had been, much less where a house had been. This is a leader of the joint in Warsaw after the war, but the Joint Distribution Committee, the Jewish Labor Committee, gave some money using pre-war aerial photographs and using the spire of the church that survived. They kind of figured out where Novolipki 68 must have been. They started digging. Now, as I said, Wasser, whose back is to the camera here, he survived by a very thin margin, once jumping from a train, taking him to Treblinka. The guy in the mustache, Michal Borovich, also a very important Jewish intellectual, he also survived by a thin margin. He was hanged in the Janowska labor camp in Lvov, but the rope broke. And the SS man, being a gentleman, didn't believe in hanging people twice. He was returned to the camp, and then he escaped. And this is taken on September 18th, 1946, as they discover the tin boxes, the first cache, which was buried on August 3rd, 1942, and which contains Auerbach's note that I was talking about. This is Wasser opening some of the documents from the tin boxes. These are the tin boxes. No, that's not Auerbach. That's another woman who worked at the Jewish Historical Institute. The second cache of the archive was found unexpectedly in December 1950. By that time, Auerbach and Wasser had already left for Israel. Polish construction workers were building new buildings on the site of the former ghetto, and they came across 2 aluminum milk cans. And their eyes lit up because everybody knew that every Jew was loaded with gold and diamonds. And it was after the war, in many ways, Poland resembled the Klondike gold rush, where people were digging up earth in the former death camps looking for gold. And when the workers saw that the milk cans were full of paper, they were going to junk it all. Ringelblum's diary, the writings of the Piaseczner Rebbe, the diary of Avram Lewin, all would have been junked. But the foreman came back from his lunch break just then and said, "We can't junk this, we have to send it to the Jewish Historical Institute." This is Emanuel Ringelblum as a young man, student at Warsaw University. This is a lovely picture. This was taken in 1935 in Vilna at the Second Congress of YIVO. And at the very left, we see Ringelblum, and then in black, we see Itzik Monger, we see Rokhl Auerbach, then we see Jacob Schatzky, who by this time was living in New York. He wrote the Great History of Warsaw Jewry, and he founded the American branch of the YIVO. Second from the right is Raphael Mahler, who came to the United States in 1938. This is Ringelblum, his wife Judita, and their little son Yuri when Yuri was born. This is Ringelblum and his son, who he adored. And I tracked down a woman in Queens, Hannah Hirschhout, who was Ringelblum's student at a high school for middle-class Jewish girls in Warsaw, where the girls spoke Polish instead of Yiddish, where they kind of looked down on Dr. Ringelblum, who had to do 4 or 5 different gigs to put food on the table. And he would come into class a little bit sweaty, a little bit disheveled. And when the girls didn't want to take an exam, one would be delegated to raise her hand and say, Dr. Ringelblum, you haven't talked about your boy lately. And Ringelblum would pull out his wallet, show pictures, talk about his son, and then they wouldn't have to take the exam. Hirschhout's future husband, Yechiel Hirschhout, was a Yiddish journalist who was in the Paviak prison in 1944 when Ringelblum, his wife's son, and 34 other Jews were brought in from a bunker which had been betrayed. And Hirschhout and the other prisoners were trying to find a way to save Ringelblum's life. And they thought maybe they could pay off guards and have him leave one cell and go to another cell. And Ringelblum had been badly beaten, and his son was sitting on his lap. And Hirschhout outlined his scheme. He explained that they couldn't save his son and wife. And Ringelblum said, no, I'm not going to leave them. And he was shot the next day with all the Jews and 2 of the Poles who maintained the hideout. But the last words that Hirschhout remembers Ringelblum saying in Yiddish, he looked at his son and he said, Was ist schuldig der Kleiner? Zu liebem wegt mir stark das Herz. Why is this little one guilty? Because of him, my heart is really breaking. And this is Gela Sextin and their little daughter, Margalit. Sextin's husband, Israel Lichtenstein, and 2 teenage boys were the ones that buried the first cache of the archive, and they appended their last wills and testaments. And finally, the Oyneg Shabes knew that the Germans were using the camera as a weapon. And so the Oyneg Shabes also tried to use the camera as a weapon. But instead of showing Jews as degraded, filthy vermin, the camera tried to show Jews fighting for their survival. And one of the pictures that survived, most pictures were ruined by the water seepage in the tin boxes. But one picture that survived were the smugglers, Poles and Jews, usually members of the pre-war underworld, because those were the skills that you needed to be a good smuggler. And by definition, it had to be Polish and Jewish. The smuggling furnished the ghetto with about 90% of the calories that were consumed. And therefore, you might say that it was a major act of resistance. 80% of the Jews were still alive in July 1942 when the deportations began. Okay, I think I'll stop here and take questions.
I hesitate to ask this as the first question, but not seeing anybody else. You mentioned correctly that the 1925 conference of YIVO in Vilna was the second conference, if I heard you correctly.
Excuse me,
You mentioned that the conference of YIVO in Vilna in 1925, if I heard you correctly, was the second conference of YIVO. 1935. I see. Were there conferences held?
There was one in 1928. I think the first conference was in 1929, if I'm not mistaken. I won't swear by that, but the second conference was in 1935.
And the
August 1935.
And the 1929 conference, where was that held?
That was in Vilna.
And what was held in Chernovitz before then?
Excuse me?
She answered my question. And Chernovitz was in 1908.
Chernovitz was in 1908. The YIVO was founded in 1925.
Thank you.
And so this is a big anniversary, the 100th anniversary.
Well, if there are no questions, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about the materials today and just mention your other book for those that are curious to learn more about the Oyneg Shabes archive.
About Emanuel Ringelblum?
Yeah, just can you just tell us a little bit about the materials that survive today, you know, access to them, where they're located, and just mention very briefly about the other book that you wrote.
Yeah, I wrote a book about Emanuel Ringelblum and the Oyneg Shabes archive. It was entitled Who Will Write Our History? And Roberta Grossman and Nancy Spielberg made a movie, a docudrama, you might say, or a documentary film. And it's been translated into 8 languages. It's not just the study of the archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's not just the study of cultural resistance, but it's also a reminder that to understand Jewish life in the ghettos, you really had to dig back into the pre-war period. And that ghettos were not concentration camps. While each ghetto was different, the fact was that the links between the pre-war and the wartime culture were very important. For example, the Oyneg Shabes was really a continuation of the YIVO ethos. And this is one of the things that I tried to show in the book.
Thank you so much, Professor Kassow.
Okay.
And I want to say we have copies of this book that are going to be for sale in the lobby. And for viewers joining online, the book is also available from YIVO's online store. Okay, we have one more question.
Thank you for a very informative lecture and putting it all together in my mind. And I didn't come in with a lot of knowledge, just general. And your metaphor of the tsunami and the flood was really focuses it. My question is, like my whole life, I've heard how the Jews didn't rebel. They took it, they went along, and then there was always the Warsaw Rebellion was pointed at. Were there other rebellions that we didn't hear about, or is not of renown?
Oh, there were many rebellions. I mean, there were many rebellions in the small towns. There were rebellions in the death camps in Treblinka, in Sobibor. Jews who were shackled and who were used to burn bodies and imprisoned in deep pits managed to escape. There were attempted rebellions in the Białystok Ghetto, in the Vilna Ghetto. Jews fought in the partisan. So yes. That said, one of the problems that I had, and that many others had, was that in the early years of the State of Israel, I'm talking about the 1950s, many survivors encountered a rather chilly reception, especially from Sabras, who felt superior, who said, well, why didn't you fight? We would not have let ourselves have this happen to us. And therefore, events like the Warsaw Ghetto uprising were interpreted as something that saved the honor of the Jewish people, as if the Jews who were not fighters in the uprising were somehow compromised. And it was the fighters who saved the honor of the Jewish people, an invidious comparison between the fighters and the ordinary Jews. Now, with the Eichmann trial, then with the Six-Day War, then with the Yom Kippur War, this feeling of this complicated feeling toward the survivors gave way to more empathy and more understanding, but it took time. Oh yeah, I mean, I'll give you another example. One of a terrible experience for Auerbach was the Eichmann trial itself, because she was supposed to testify. She did testify, but she was told she'd be given an hour and a half. And she prepared a long testimony about Ringelblum, about the archive, about the soup kitchens, about the self-help. Well, unfortunately, the order of the witnesses changed at the last minute, and she was preceded by Yitzhak Zuckerman and Sivya Lubetkin, two rock stars of the resistance. And they, of course, galvanized the audience and electrified everybody who was watching. And Auerbach then followed them, and she insisted on testifying in Hebrew, which was not her first language. And the judge became very bored with her talk about the soup kitchens. And he cut her off after half an hour. And she felt humiliated, and she never forgot that. And when Roberta Grossman was making the movie based on my book, she wanted the video of Auerbach's testimony, but somehow they lost it. The videos of all the other witnesses were available, but somehow maybe her testimony is considered to be so unimportant that they never even bothered to save it. Okay.
Thank you so much.